When American pilots first encountered the Mitsubishi Zero, they could hardly believe their eyes. Sleek, fast, and impossibly agile, it seemed to defy the very laws of flight. In those first terrifying months of the Pacific War, the Zero carved a legend that shook US airmen to their core. What America thought of this fighter in 1941 was nothing short of shock, fear, and disbelief. First sightings. America meets the Zero. On December 7, 1941, the skies over Pearl Harbor roared with engines unfamiliar to American ears. Among them, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero cut through the chaos like a knife. As US pilots scrambled into the air, they were immediately confronted by an aircraft that turned tighter, climbed faster, and struck with precision they hadn't seen before. To men trained to fly Wildcats and Buffaloes, the Zero appeared supernatural. Dogfights lasted only seconds before American fighters spiraled into the sea or tumbled in flames. Reports flooded in. Japanese planes outmaneuvered every defensive attempt, diving and looping with ease. At Clark Field in the Philippines and Wake Island, the pattern repeated. Pilots swore the Zero could climb like a hawk and outturn any machine America had. The shock wasn't limited to combat crews. Intelligence officers, reviewing after-action reports, were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. Japan, long dismissed as technologically inferior, had unleashed a fighter superior to anything in America's arsenal. The Zero's arrival was more than a tactical surprise. It was a psychological earthquake. The US Navy, confident in its own engineering, suddenly realized its doctrine and its planes were inadequate. For American flyers, the first encounters left a haunting impression. The sky belonged to the Zero, and survival meant luck more than skill. The Myth of Invincibility. As battles raged across the Pacific in early 1942, the Zero's reputation spread faster than the aircraft itself. Newspapers described it as a super fighter, and American pilots whispered of its almost magical abilities. To many, it seemed invincible. Every clash reinforced the myth. In the skies above the Philippines, Burma, and the Coral Sea, US fighters went down in droves. The Zero's lightweight design and unmatched agility allowed it to dominate turning duels, and its long range gave Japanese pilots freedom to strike where Americans thought themselves safe. Rumors exaggerated its capabilities further. Some claimed it could outpace any Allied fighter, climb vertically without stalling, even survive dozens of hits. These stories, half fact and half legend, deepened the fear. US airmen began to question their chances before they ever took off. The mythology was amplified by victories like the fall of Singapore and early naval clashes, where Allied losses appeared hopelessly lopsided. Military planners in Washington worried aloud. Was the Zero a weapon years ahead of anything America could build? To the public, the narrative hardened. Japan had an unstoppable warplane, while the US trailed behind. Yet the truth was more complicated. What the Zero possessed in agility and range, it sacrificed in armor and protection. But in those early months, when shock clouded judgment, those weaknesses went unnoticed. To Americans in 1942, the Zero wasn't just another enemy fighter. It was a ghost in the sky, an unbeatable predator haunting every mission. Shockwaves through US command. The shock wasn't confined to the pilots who faced the Zero in combat. Across the US military command structure, alarm bells rang. Before Pearl Harbor, American intelligence had underestimated Japan's aviation industry, assuming its designs were derivative and outdated. The Zero shattered that illusion. Reports from survivors painted the same picture. Japanese fighters turned inside American planes, outclimbed them, and overwhelmed defenses with relentless attacks. Senior commanders realized the balance of air power had shifted. The Bureau of Aeronautics, responsible for naval aircraft development, was particularly shaken. If Japan had managed to field such an advanced machine in large numbers, America faced not just tactical setbacks, but strategic disaster. Training manuals suddenly felt obsolete. Tactics based on engaging lumbering enemy fighters no longer applied. The Wildcat, America's frontline carrier fighter, was now exposed as underpowered and outmaneuvered. Panic rippled through planning rooms as the Navy and Army Air Forces struggled to find answers. Meetings turned urgent as engineers and tacticians debated. Should they attempt to copy the Zero or focus on building something entirely different? In Washington, debates grew heated. Some believed the Zero was too advanced to counter quickly, urging defensive strategies and conserving resources. Others argued America's industrial capacity could outpace Japan's if only the weaknesses of the Zero could be discovered. Meanwhile, pilots were told to fight on with outdated tactics, often at deadly cost. The shockwave extended into morale. A sense of vulnerability seeped into the ranks. The once confident US command, proud of its technological edge, found itself humbled. The Zero had not only won battles in the air, it had forced America's leaders to rethink the entire war effort, sparking a desperate race to regain dominance. Testing the enemy. Captured Zero reveals the truth. The turning point in America's understanding of the Mitsubishi Zero came not from combat reports, but from a stroke of luck. In June 1942, a Zero crash-landed on Akutan Island in the Aleutians, nearly intact. For American engineers, it was like finding the enemy's playbook lying open. The aircraft was quickly salvaged, repaired, and flown for exhaustive testing. What they discovered shocked them again, but in a very different way. Up close, the Zero's strengths were undeniable. Its controls were feather-light, allowing maneuvers that most American fighters could never attempt. Its range was extraordinary, a product of both its efficient engine and stripped-down design. Yet those very qualities revealed critical weaknesses. The Zero had no armor protection for the pilot and carried only limited self-sealing in its fuel tanks. American engineers concluded that while it excelled in agility, it could not withstand heavy fire. This revelation spread rapidly through US squadrons. Suddenly, the aura of invincibility began to crack. Tactics shifted. Instead of engaging the Zero in turning duels, pilots were instructed to dive, use speed, and exploit its fragility. Bulletins circulated warning flyers never to dogfight on the Zero's terms. With these new insights, training emphasized altitude advantage and boom and zoom attacks, where American fighters dove on the enemy and escaped before the Zero could counter. The captured plane became a teaching tool, flown against US designs to simulate real combat. For the first time, American flyers had a way to fight back intelligently rather than relying on blind courage. The Akutan Zero, as it came to be known, shifted perception dramatically. What had seemed an unstoppable predator was revealed as a carefully balanced machine with hidden flaws. The myth of invincibility collapsed, and in its place rose a new determination. America could outthink, outbuild, and outfight the Zero. Turning the tables, American adaptations in the sky. Armed with knowledge from the captured Zero and months of bloody lessons, America began to adapt. The first changes came in tactics. Pilots were instructed never to dogfight but to use speed and altitude. The Thatch Weave, developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, allowed wildcats to cover one another, crossing paths to trap pursuing Zeros in deadly crossfire. It was a clever tactic born from desperation, but it worked, giving US squadrons a fighting chance. Still, tactics alone were not enough. America needed machines capable of outclassing the Zero. That answer arrived in 1943 with the Grumman F-6F Hellcat and Vought F-4U Corsair. Heavier, faster, and equipped with more powerful engines, these fighters embraced the lessons learned. They carried thicker armor, self-sealing tanks, and a heavier punch with 6.50 caliber guns. Against the fragile Zero, they were devastating. Suddenly, American pilots no longer fought on the enemy's terms. They dictated the battles. The Hellcat in particular became the Zero's executioner, boasting kill ratios that reversed the early war nightmare. For the US command, these adaptations were vindication. Where Japan relied on finesse and agility, America leaned into power, durability, and sheer numbers. Industrial might ensured fleets of new planes rolled off assembly lines faster than Japan could replace losses. By late 1943, the once feared Zero was being cut down in droves. In the Marianas, the Philippine Sea, and beyond, American fighters swept the skies clean, shredding Japan's air arm. Pilots who once dreaded facing the Zero now spoke of exploiting its weaknesses with grim efficiency. The tables had turned completely. What America thought of the Zero was no longer fear, but opportunity. The chance to prove that superior industry, tactics, and innovation could overcome any early disadvantage. The hunter had become the hunted. From fear to exploitation, breaking the Zero's aura. By 1944, the Mitsubishi Zero was no longer the terror it had been in 1941. Instead, it was becoming a symbol of Japan's inability to keep pace with the accelerating demands of modern air combat. American pilots had learned the formula: never turn with a Zero, never linger in its strike zone, and always leverage superior firepower. Once these rules became ingrained, encounters grew increasingly one-sided. For veterans who had endured the Zero's dominance in the early months, the reversal was almost surreal. Accounts from US squadrons spoke of deliberate hunts where American fighters sought Zeros out not with dread, but with determination to prove their superiority. Even the Zero's famed range advantage eroded as US carriers pushed closer to Japan's island bastions. Strategic bombing raids and amphibious invasions forced the Zero into defensive roles, flying from airstrips under constant threat. Losses mounted, and replacements lacked the experience of the pilots who had once wrung miracles from the plane. In American intelligence circles, the Zero shifted from being studied in awe to being analyzed clinically, its weaknesses highlighted as evidence of Japan's declining war capacity. Propaganda even painted it as fragile, reinforcing the message to US flyers that they could dominate the skies. The aura of invincibility was broken, and with it, Japanese morale suffered. Pilots who once flew with supreme confidence now faced swarms of Hellcats and Corsairs, their beloved Zero outclassed at every turn. For America, the change was profound. The Zero was no longer an enemy to fear, but a machine to exploit, its vulnerabilities laid bare. It became a case study in how myths collapse once tested by technology, strategy, and relentless firepower. America's perception had shifted from shock to mastery, marking a turning point in the Pacific Air War. Legacy of a legend. Respect in retrospect. Though the Zero was eventually defeated, America never entirely dismissed its legacy. In hindsight, even as they celebrated their dominance, US pilots and commanders spoke of the aircraft with a grudging respect. The Zero had exposed America's unpreparedness, humbling a nation that assumed technological superiority. It forced innovation, driving the creation of tactics and fighters that would define the rest of the war. In that sense, the Zero shaped America's aviation destiny as much as any domestic design. Veterans who once cursed its agility later admitted it was a remarkable achievement, especially given Japan's limited industrial base. The Zero represented the pinnacle of pre-war Japanese design philosophy, lightweight, agile, and deadly in the hands of skilled pilots. For a time, it ruled the skies uncontested. To America, its story became both warning and lesson. No enemy should ever again be underestimated. Intelligence gaps and assumptions had cost dearly in 1941, and the Zero was the embodiment of that oversight. Yet by 1945, when atomic bombs dropped from America's own B-29s, the contrast was staggering. Japan's iconic fighter had become outdated, a relic of an earlier phase of the war. Its legend lived on, not in victories, but in the respect it commanded from those who faced it. Even decades later, the Zero appeared in American histories as a symbol of both fear and admiration, remembered not only for the terror it inspired, but also for the innovation it provoked. In the end, what America thought of the Mitsubishi Zero was complex. First awe, then dread, followed by ruthless exploitation, and finally, enduring respect for an aircraft that had once seemed unstoppable. The Mitsubishi Zero's story in American eyes is one of transformation, fear turned into mastery, and shock turned into respect. In 1941, it was the Phantom that haunted US skies, a sleek predator no American pilot felt prepared to fight. Within just a few years, however, it had become something very different, a symbol of how quickly myths can be broken once knowledge, tactics, and technology catch up. For America, the Zero was both a nightmare and a teacher. It forced an entire nation to adapt, to innovate, and to harness its industrial power in ways Japan could never match. Yet even in defeat, the Zero never lost its mystique. American flyers who once cursed its dominance would later acknowledge its brilliance, admitting that only a truly extraordinary aircraft could have dominated the Pacific so completely in those early days. In the end, the Zero stands as more than a Japanese fighter. It became a reminder to America that wars are not won by confidence alone, but by the relentless pursuit of better machines, better strategies, and the will to learn from one's enemy.